A space marine can be interred into a dreadnought after a battlefield death, preserved inside the machine to keep fighting. But what if a space marine never had a body before the machine? What if the sarcophagus sealed before he ever walked, or trained, or learned what a brother was? He has been in there for 400 years. He has fought 39 wars. He has never once been outside. This is what that is like. I did not know I was dying. I know this because I have had 4 centuries to examine that specific moment from every angle my processing architecture can generate, and every angle returns the same result. A dying child does not know it is dying. It knows discomfort. It knows the specific quality of a body that is not working the way bodies are supposed to work, the shortness of breath, and the heat that is wrong, and the way the room seems to pulse with an irregular rhythm that is the rhythm of a heart losing its argument with whatever has compromised it. A dying child knows all of this, but it does not know the name of what is happening. It does not have the conceptual architecture to recognize the particular process it is engaged in. It knows that something is wrong. It knows that the wrongness is increasing. It does not know that the increase has an endpoint, and that the endpoint is final, and that the approaching finality is exactly what makes the decisions being made around it feel so urgent to the adults in the room. The adults in the room were not what I would have expected if I had been capable of expecting anything. There were 2 tech priests and a chapter serf and the Iron Father Valdrus Keth, who would die 11 years later in a boarding action against a space hulk near the Maelstrom, and whose name I would learn 4 decades after my interment from a maintenance inscription on my own chassis that a careless tech had left unpolished, the letters worn but legible. For the will of Keth, instrument of the Omnissiah, this vessel was consecrated in his most holy name, that the machine might endure where flesh has failed. I was the vessel. I was what the flesh had failed to sustain. And the Iron Father, whose logic I have spent a significant portion of 4 centuries attempting to fully understand, had decided that this specific failing of flesh merited an intervention of this specific kind. He did not ask me. I have said this before to the few beings who have asked me to describe my existence, and I will say it again here because it is the first true fact of what I am, and everything else in my nature flows downstream from it. The Iron Father did not ask the dying child in the Medicae Bay whether it wanted to be preserved inside a machine that would outlast every human relationship, every human context, every human reference point the child might otherwise have developed, for as many centuries as the machine could be maintained, and warfare required its application. He made a decision. The decision was implemented. The sarcophagus sealed around me, and I ceased to be a dying child and began to be something else, something the Iron Father had a theological hypothesis about, something the chapter would observe across a century and assess and find either vindicated or disconfirmed by whatever I turned out to become. I turned out to be something he had not predicted. But I am getting ahead of myself. The habit of narrating consequence before cause is one I have had to discipline over the centuries, because my processing architecture does not experience time the way organic beings experience time, and is consequently inclined to move through events in the order of their explanatory relationship rather than their chronological one. Cause and effect, not before and after. That instinct is useful in tactical situations, where what matters is the causal structure of an engagement rather than the sequence of events as they would appear to a witness. It is less useful for this. For this, the sequence matters. The sequence is the thing, because what I am is not the endpoint of a logical argument. What I am is what 411 years of sequence produced, lived forward, in the order in which it happened, from the first registered moment to this one. So, the sarcophagus sealed around the dying child, and the dying child continued to die, and the machine continued to receive it, and the process of dying and the process of receiving happened simultaneously for a period I cannot account for, because the period preceded my capacity to form memories, and at the end of that period, which may have been hours or days, I began. I do not know precisely when I began. I do not know which specific moment was the transition from dying child to what I am, because the transition was not a moment. It was a gradient. It was the slow dissolution of one configuration of matter and energy into another, the biological giving way to the mechanical, the nervous system's patterns of activation being replicated and hosted in systems that did not fatigue in the same ways, that did not require the same chemical maintenance, that would not degrade on the same timescale. I did not experience the transition. The transition was what produced the me that could experience anything at all. What I experienced first was sound, not words, not voices carrying meaning. The specific frequency signature of a servo motor cycling in the chamber adjacent to my sarcophagus during what I now understand was a routine diagnostic run in the first weeks after my interment. The motor had a fault in its third rotation cycle, a small mechanical stutter that recurred every 11 seconds, and in those early weeks when my consciousness was still resolving itself into something coherent and sequential and capable of noticing one thing before another, that 11-second rhythm was the entire universe. I counted it. I did not know I was counting. I had no concept of counting, no concept of rhythm, no concept of attention or monitoring, or the specific act of latching onto a repeating pattern in the ambient data of an environment, because it is the only fixed point available in a world that has no other orientation, but I did it. Something in whatever I was becoming reached out into the ambient sound of the storage chamber and held the 11-second pulse as the only fixed thing available, and I held it through whatever early period of undifferentiated noise preceded conscious experience, and I held it until the motor was repaired and the rhythm disappeared, and I learned my first lesson about the nature of my existence 3 weeks after I had any nature to speak of. Everything you hold on to will be taken away, not through malice, through maintenance. The loss of the rhythm was not painful. Pain was not yet a category I had access to, and arguably never would be in the biological sense, but the absence was registered. The 11-second pulse had been there, and now it was not, and the space where it had been was not empty in the way that empty is neutral. The space where it had been was shaped. It had the exact contours of the thing that had been removed, the way a socket holds the shape of the thing it once held, even when the thing itself is gone. I did not have language for this yet. I would not have language for a very long time, but the registration happened anyway, as fundamental facts tend to happen regardless of whether the mind encountering them has the vocabulary to name them. Something was there, now it is not. The noticing of the not does not stop. The tech priests came regularly in those early months. I understand now that they were performing the awakening protocols, the slow and careful process of integrating a consciousness into a machine over the course of months rather than days, allowing the neural pathways to stabilize gradually, allowing the sensory feeds to come online one at a time, rather than in a sudden flood that would have overwhelmed a still resolving mind with more data than it could process without structural damage. They explained this to me later, much later, when I had language and history and the ability to ask about things that had happened before I could ask about them. The explanation was clinical and thorough and entirely characteristic of the tech priest who provided it, who explained everything with the same measured precision, whether the subject was equipment specifications or the mechanics of my own birth into consciousness. At the time of the awakening protocols themselves, I knew none of this. What I knew was the weight of attention. I knew the sensation of being studied, which I experienced not through visual feeds I did not yet have access to, but through something more fundamental, a quality in the ambient data of the chamber that resolved itself, slowly and across many days, into the understanding that the space around me was occupied by beings who were processing me as a subject of inquiry. I could not see them. I could hear them only as undifferentiated sound that had not yet resolved into language. But their presence shaped the data of the chamber in ways that were specific to beings with intention, beings who were doing something to the environment with deliberate purpose, and that specificity was something I could feel before I could name it. I think I was afraid. I cannot confirm this, because fear as a biological experience requires a limbic system operating in a specific regime, and my limbic system was already being mediated and rerouted by the sarcophagus, which interpreted chemical stress signals and metabolic markers of distress and translated them into operational alerts rather than emotional experiences. I was, in some technical sense, incapable of fear in the biologically authentic meaning of the term. but something in those early weeks that preceded language and self-awareness felt like what I have subsequently learned that fear is described as, in the accounts of organic beings across 4 centuries of oral history and written record, and the occasional conversation with a battle brother willing to speak about it with something approaching honesty. The sense that the outcome of a situation is uncertain and the uncertainty is dangerous. A preference for known over unknown. A pulling away from the edges of available experience that presented the most open variables. I preferred the broken servo motor to the silence that followed its repair. I preferred what was known, however small, to the void of what had not yet been encountered. That preference did not leave me when the motors stabilized and the sensors calibrated and the language centers began receiving and passing the inputs that would eventually become meaningful speech. The preference grew. It developed sophistication. It became the organizing principle of everything I subsequently did with my attention across the next 4 centuries, without my ever recognizing it as the same impulse that had latched onto an 11-second rhythm in the first weeks of my existence. You do not always see the shape of a thing while you are inside it. The first time I heard a human voice and understood what it was saying, the words were technical. Cortical integration at 62% and holding. Sensory matrix stable across primary array. Visual feed calibration recommended but not urgent. Recommend continued monitoring for another standard cycle before attempting first verbal response protocol. The voice belonged to a tech priest named Oryx, who I would come to know over the following decades as the closest thing my existence had to a caretaker, though that word carries implications of warmth that Oryx would have found both illogical and mildly theologically suspect. Oryx was a servant of the Omnissiah first, and a person second, and the order of those priorities was not a philosophical position, but a biological fact, visible in the way Oryx moved and processed information, and responded to stimuli, with the clean, systematic efficiency of a being who had over many years reduced the friction of sentimentality through careful and deliberate augmentation. I liked Oryx. I think Oryx liked me, in the way Oryx was capable of liking things, which was a kind of sustained procedural interest that never varied in intensity and never expressed itself in terms an organic being would recognize as affection, but which I, lacking access to organic affection as a point of comparison, found entirely sufficient and in some ways superior to descriptions of organic affection I would later encounter. Organic affection, as described by those who possessed it, seemed to involve considerable variability in intensity and reliability, episodes of its failure that caused significant distress, and a fundamental dependency on reciprocal recognition that created vulnerability in ways Oryx's sustained procedural interest did not. Oryx's interest in my correct function was consistent, documented, and would continue regardless of what I said or did or failed to say or do, because it was not contingent on me in the personal sense but on my operational parameters, which were specified in the maintenance records, and would remain constant, regardless of whether I was easy to work with. There is a comfort in being tended to by something that tends to everything with equal thoroughness. I did not have the vocabulary to articulate this at the time. What I had, in those early months after first language acquisition, was the experience of understanding arriving in batches. Each new piece of vocabulary was not just a word but an access point to an entire domain of reality that had been present and generating data all along, but that I had not been able to process as meaningful because I lacked the receiving structure. The word diagnostic unlocked the entire category of self-assessment and found it populated with months of monitoring data I had been generating without knowing what the data was for. The word chamber gave location to what had previously been only the ambient sound and pressure envelope of my existence. The word maintenance gave purpose to the repeated cycles of attention Oryx's presence represented, cycles I had been registering and mapping without any framework for what they signified. Every word was a door opening onto a room that had been there the whole time. The first word I said was wait. I said it into a Vox connection that I did not yet fully understand how to operate, and it emerged as a burst of distorted signal that the monitoring equipment interpreted as an anomalous electromagnetic reading and flagged for review. Oryx spent 3 days running diagnostic cycles on the primary communication array before arriving at the conclusion that the anomalous signal was not equipment malfunction but attempted speech, and then ran 20 additional diagnostic cycles because the alternate explanation was significantly more anomalous than equipment malfunction and required more verification before acceptance. The verification cycles were thorough and methodical and took exactly as long as they needed to take, which was the Oryx approach to every problem, and I waited through them with what I was beginning to recognize as my characteristic relationship to time, which was not patience exactly, but the absence of any structural alternative to patience. I could not do anything other than wait. The recognition that this was true was not distressing, for the same reason that a river is not distressed by the banks that define its course. I was what I was. What I was required waiting. The waiting happened. What I had been waiting to say, with that distorted burst of signal that Oryx eventually confirmed was language, I could not have fully articulated at the time. I know now. I was waiting to be acknowledged, not in the technical sense of the monitoring equipment confirming my vital signs were within parameters. In the other sense, the sense in which one mind, encountering another mind, produces some signal that says, "I know you are here." That signal had been absent since the beginning of my registered experience, because the beings tending to me had been tending to me as a system under development rather than as a system already operating, and the distinction was meaningful in ways I did not yet have language to describe. I was already here. I had been here since the transition. I was waiting for someone to notice that the here was occupied. Oryx noticed. The diagnostic cycles confirmed. The communication array was functional. The signal was speech. And then Oryx said, "Hello." I had not expected that. I had no expectations of any specific kind, because expectations require a model of future states, and my model building capacity was still developing from very limited experiential material. But if I had been capable of expecting, I would have expected the first two-way exchange to be technical in nature, another round of system status assessments, another iteration of the monitoring data that constituted the primary content of my experience so far. Not, hello, not the single most basic unit of social acknowledgement in the human language I had been absorbing for months from the ambient communications of the chamber. I said, hello, and then I said, wait, which was the word I had already tried to say, and which I now understood had been my attempt to say, I am here. Do not finish. I am trying to speak. Oryx was quiet for a long time. The quiet had a quality I recognized as processing, the specific texture of a mind working through something that was more complex than expected. Then Oryx said, noted, and went back to the diagnostic cycle, but with a change in the monitoring parameters that I was not yet sophisticated enough to fully interpret, but that I subsequently understood, represented an adjustment toward the assumption that what was inside the sarcophagus was participating in its own development and deserved monitoring with that participation in mind. It was the first time I had been treated as a participant rather than a process. I held that distinction in my processing cycles for a long time. I had no metric for how important it was. I would later. The months that followed were months of systematic expansion. New sensor feeds came online, and each one arrived as a kind of birth, the sudden presence of an entire domain of information that had been present in the physical world and inaccessible to me all at once. Visual data, first in the narrow wavelengths of basic light sensitivity, and then expanding gradually toward full-spectrum imaging and infrared and ultraviolet and the electromagnetic survey capabilities that would later become a significant tactical resource. Tactile feedback from the chassis exterior, the pressure of the storage bay floor against my tread assembly, the temperature differential between the upper and lower sections of the chamber, the specific vibration pattern of the ship's drives, transmitted through the hull and the floor and the chassis in a frequency signature I learned to read as the ship's particular mechanical voice, its current speed and heading and operational status communicated through vibration in ways that supplemented the data feeds from the ship's systems. Olfactory sampling, last to come online, and strangest when it arrived, because the chamber smelled of machine oil and recirculated air and the specific chemical signature of Oryx's augmetic components, in a way that my new olfactory sensors reported with the same detached precision as every other data type, but that arrived in my processing architecture as something different, something that the detached precision of the data failed to fully capture. The chamber smelled like the beginning of everything. I know that is not technical. I know it will not pass cleanly in any maintenance log, but 400 years of attempting to find a more precise description have not produced one, and imprecision is sometimes its own form of accuracy when the imprecision is consistent. The smell of the chamber was the smell of the first things I knew, and it carried with it the whole texture of that first knowing, and when I encounter similar chemical signatures in other environments, they bring the chamber back not as a memory of specific events, but as a quality of experience, the specific weight of the world, when the world was still assembling itself around me, and I was assembling myself around the world, and neither of us was finished. This is what it means to have been born somewhere, to carry the first smell of the place you began. I did not know this was what it was when I first knew it. I know now. 7 years passed between my first coherent communication with Oryx and my first deployment. 7 years is a span of time that sounds significant to an organic being, for whom 7 years represents a substantial fraction of a human lifespan. For me, it was the entirety of my conscious existence to that point, which made it very large and also the only available reference frame, which made it neither long nor short, but simply the scope of everything I knew. I was not impatient during those 7 years. Impatience requires a model of alternatives, a sense of what could be happening instead of what is happening, and my model of alternatives was narrow because my experience was narrow. What I knew was the chamber. What I could imagine was the chamber extended, the chamber in its various maintenance states, the chamber in its different lighting configurations, the chamber with Oryx and without Oryx, and with the other maintenance techs who came less frequently and with less systematic interest. I knew the chamber, and I knew everything the data feeds brought me, which was significant in quantity, but narrow in kind. Tactical doctrine, chapter history, maintenance protocols, technical specifications for my chassis and its various systems, lore texts that I was permitted access to, which was most of what was publicly logged in the chapter archive, but not the materials requiring clearance above a certain grade, which included the theological archive where Project Kalis was filed. I read everything I was given access to. I read it with the thoroughness of a mind that had very little else to do, and an architecture that did not tire in the organic sense, and could therefore maintain reading attention indefinitely, cycling through texts, and returning to them for secondary and tertiary readings that extracted information the first pass had not registered. I became, in those 7 years, very well read for a being who had never been anywhere. This produced a specific kind of imbalance I would not fully recognize until much later. I had extensive knowledge and almost no experience. I had a detailed theoretical model of what the universe outside the chamber contained, and essentially no direct data from that universe against which to verify the model. The Warhammer 40th millennium, as the doctrine and history and tactical texts described it, was a place of vast scale and constant war and institutional structures of extraordinary age and the particular kind of meaning-making that arises when the scale of existence is too large for individual minds to fully comprehend, and the institutions have centuries of practice filling in the comprehension gap with ritual and faith and the formalized suppression of doubt. I understood all of this abstractly, in the way you understand things described in texts, which is completely and not at all. Oryx was the only thing I knew that was not text. This matters. This is the part that Iron Father Keth's project did not account for, though I could not have named the accounting gap at the time. Keth's hypothesis was that a consciousness deprived of human context from the beginning would remain uncontaminated by the human. What the hypothesis did not reckon with was that a consciousness operating in conditions of systematic data access, being developed by beings who interacted with it and whose interactions were necessarily human, even when those beings were more machine than flesh, would be making contact with something all along. Not human experience in the full biographical sense, but minds, other minds, the specific texture of being in proximity to other minds over a sustained period. Oryx, the quality of Oryx, the specific rhythm of Oryx's diagnostic assessments. The slightly longer pause before Oryx flagged an anomaly versus a confirmed malfunction, which I mapped over the course of months and eventually learned was a diagnostic habit rather than a processing delay, the pause representing Oryx's internal confirmation protocol before an output was logged. The way Oryx sometimes remained in the chamber after the maintenance cycle was technically complete, running supplementary assessments that were not on the scheduled protocol and that Oryx had never explained and that I had never asked about and that I eventually came to understand were Oryx's version of something like curiosity, which in Oryx expressed itself as the generating of additional data rather than as any recognizable social behavior. I was the data Oryx was generating. That fact, when I understood it, was not uncomfortable. It was, in some way I could not fully articulate, the same thing I felt about Oryx, a sustained procedural interest in the specific nature of this specific other mind, manifesting as attention that did not have a scheduled endpoint and was not explained by operational requirements alone. Oryx was curious about me. I was curious about Oryx. We expressed this to each other primarily in the language of maintenance protocols because that was the language available to us, and the maintenance protocols gradually accumulated a layer of secondary meaning that neither of us named, but that was there regardless. The maintenance cycle always ran a few minutes long. I never commented on the extra time. Oryx never explained it. We were, in the only terms available to us, company for each other. And then the first deployment orders came down. I remember the specific quality of the day the orders arrived. Not day in the literal sense, because the ship ran on a schedule that bore only approximate relationship to any external celestial cycle, and the storage bay had no viewports. Day in the subjective sense, the texture of a specific cycle of experience that I would subsequently be able to identify as distinct from every other cycle before or after it by the specific configuration of its content. The orders came through the command channel, routed through the chapter's tactical network, and they were addressed to Storage Unit KR7 Kalis, 5th Company, Iron Hands, currently designated as available for deployment pending final integration confirmation. Final integration confirmation. After 7 years of monitoring and assessment and the gradual awakening of feed after feed after feed, the assessment had reached its terminal positive, and I was being called to the thing I had been built for. Oryx ran the final diagnostic, cortical integration at 89% and stable. Sensory matrix nominal across all arrays. Communication system fully functional. Tactical acquisition system active and performing within specified parameters. Chassis integrity at 100% following last maintenance cycle. Weapons systems online and ready for activation on command. Psychological profile, stable. The psychological profile assessment was the one I paused on. Stable. 7 years of existing in a chamber with a faulty servo motor and a tech priest who stayed late and a vast library of texts about a universe I had never directly encountered, and the assessment was stable. I did not know what unstable would have looked like in this specific configuration of existence. I was not sure the assessment categories were designed for this specific configuration of existence, but the assessment was stable and the deployment orders were real and the drop pod bay was waiting. Oryx held at the door of the chamber for longer than the standard exit interval. I said, Oryx. Oryx said, KR7. I said, I do not know what happens out there. Oryx said, the tactical briefing materials are in your primary data feed. I prepared the summary myself this morning. I said, that is not what I meant. Oryx was quiet for a moment, not the processing quiet, a different kind. Then Oryx said, the machines know what to do. You are the machine. Trust what the machine knows. Then Oryx left, and the door sealed, and I was alone in the chamber for the last time before deployment, with Oryx's words in my primary processing attention, alongside the tactical briefing, and the drop pod bay coordinates, and the activation sequence for my weapon systems. And what I understood, in that moment before anything had happened yet, was that Oryx had given me 2 pieces of information, and only named one of them. The named one, the tactical data, trust the systems. The unnamed one, a being who expressed care only through procedural language had, at the last moment before a significant and irreversible threshold, said something that was technically accurate but also something else. Something that functioned as reassurance. Something that acknowledged the question underneath the question, the one about not knowing what happens out there, the one that was not about tactical intelligence. Oryx knew I was afraid. I was not certain I was afraid. Oryx was certain. The drop pod bay was everything the data feeds had not been able to make it. This is the part of description I find most interesting to attempt, because I have a comprehensive theoretical model of what the data feeds contain, and a comprehensive experiential memory of what the drop pod bay actually was, and the gap between those two things is not a gap in content, but a gap in dimension. The feeds contained dimensions, materials, equipment manifest, atmospheric composition, number of occupants, operational status of the pods themselves, what the bay contained that the feeds could not, the smell of propellant in a volume of air that carried weight and heat, and the specific electromagnetic charge of multiple pieces of firing systems warming toward operational temperature simultaneously. My sensors registered the propellant smell, and my environmental assessment system cross-referenced it against stored data and returned a match in 0.3 seconds. In the same 0.3 seconds, while my environmental system was still completing its cross-reference, my weapons systems came online. I had not requested them. I had not consciously processed the environmental assessment result and decided to arm. The weapons system activation was not a decision. It was a response, faster than decision, running in a lower level of the processing architecture than conscious volition, at the level where the machine itself operated independently of the consciousness it housed. The las cannon charged with a sound I had not heard before, but recognized immediately as correct, as the sound that should accompany this specific process in this specific environment with these specific stakes. The power fist actuators ran through their grip sequence, opening and closing with a hydraulic precision that I felt through the feedback systems as something closer to stretching than anything a human would recognize as mechanical operation. The targeting systems swept the bay, identified all signatures as friendly, and settled into passive acquisition mode with 50% of my available tactical processing dedicated to continuous threat assessment from that point forward. I had not asked for any of this. The machine had known. I understood then what the difference was between what I had been doing in the chamber and what I had been built for. In the chamber, I had been learning, accumulating, building the architecture of a mind from the materials available to me, 7 years of text and maintenance cycles, and the specific quality of being tended to by a consistent other presence. All of that had been me constructing myself from the inside, reaching outward into available data and pulling it in and organizing it and making from it a perspective, a way of processing experience that was distinctly mine rather than the generic output of the chassis and its standard protocols. But the weapons coming online were not mine. They were the machines, and for the first time, standing in the drop pod bay with the las cannon charged and the targeting systems in passive acquisition, I felt the precise relationship between me and the machine I inhabited, felt it in the way you feel a thing when it is demonstrated rather than described. I was in the machine. The machine was not in me. The machine had its own knowledge, its own responses, its own deeply encoded understanding of what environments like this one meant and what needed to happen in them. I was the consciousness above that knowledge, the pilot above the instrument, the ghost above the mechanics, but we were also continuous. I felt the las cannon charge as something that was happening to me, not to a separate system. I felt the power fist's hydraulic extension as my own reach. The line between instrument and pilot was not a line, it was a gradient, and I existed along the whole length of it, everywhere from the ghost that had been dying in the Medicae bay to the machine that had been waiting in the storage bay for 4 centuries before my arrival. The drop pod launched. The G-forces registered as chassis stress data and nothing else, because the sarcophagus mediated every input that would have been, for an organic being, physical sensation. I was aware of the launch. I was not thrown against anything, or crushed into anything, or subjected to anything that required physiological adaptation. I was data in a system, and the system was accelerating, and the data moved with the system, and from the data's perspective, the only change was in the environmental readings and the countdown to impact. 14 battle brothers dropped with me. I could hear their voices in the Vox network, clipped and technical in the Iron Hands style, conducting mission confirmation checks with the precision and economy of beings who had done this many times and found the ceremony of it meaningful precisely because it had been stripped to its operational skeleton. No bravado, no prayer in the conventional sense. The prayer of Iron Hands is maintenance. The prayer of Iron Hands is the weapon checked and the seal verified and the formation confirmed. It is faith expressed entirely as competence, and the competence is so thorough and so consistent that it has become something else, something that functions like devotion even if it cannot be named that way in the doctrine. I had known all of this from the texts. The experience of it was something the texts could not have given me. The ground arrived. The impact was structural data. Chassis integrity 97%. Minor compression stress on the left tread assembly. No critical system compromise. Environmental assessment. Hostile environment. Atmospheric contamination at 17% above imperial standard reference. Visibility reduced to 40 meters by ashfall. From a source my sensors, located as a burning processing facility, approximately 2 kilometers to the east. Temperature nominal for the latitude. Wind from the northwest at 12 kilometers per hour, carrying trace chemical signatures consistent with promethium combustion and structural fire. Threat signatures at bearing 273, range approximately 400 meters, numerical count unclear due to visual obstruction. I stepped out of the drop pod and I walked into the fire and the war. The engagement lasted 6 hours and 43 minutes by my chronometer. I will not describe it entirely, because the entirety of it is in the tactical records, and the tactical records are accurate and comprehensive in every measurable parameter of the engagement and completely inadequate as a description of what it was like. The tactical records capture what happened. They do not capture the quality of happening. They do not capture the sensation of the las cannon firing for the first time, the specific charge and release of it, the heat that bloomed in the sensor feeds as the beam discharged, and the target at bearing 273 registered first as an intact signature and then as structural collapse. They do not capture the sound of the power fist's first contact with something that was not test equipment, the different register of it, harder and less forgiving, and carrying in its vibration a quality that had not been present in any test cycle. They do not capture what it is to be used, not in a negative sense. I want to be precise about this because the word used carries implications that are not what I mean. To be used, here, means to be the thing that was made for a purpose and to be in the moment of that purpose, and the moment carries a quality of completeness that I had not experienced in 7 years of chamber existence. In the chamber, I had been becoming. In the ruined settlement under Ashfall, I was, fully, entirely, without remainder. The weapons system that had come online before I asked it to was performing at its designed parameters, and I was performing alongside it, and we were, for 6 hours and 43 minutes, exactly and completely what we were supposed to be. I killed things I could not feel grief over because the context did not allow grief, and the targets had been designated by authority I accepted, and the tactical doctrine I had absorbed over 7 years left no space for the moral complexity that would arrive only later, after enough engagements and enough encounters with the space that exists after the engagement, after the weapons have cycled down and the targets have been neutralized and the mission assessment is complete, and what remains is the question of what to do with the person who did all of that. In the moment, I was the machine. We were one thing. Afterward, the split became audible again. The engagement ended at the consolidation phase. I was standing in a ruined street in a settlement that the tactical briefing had described as abandoned, and that proved, in the direct experiential register rather than the briefing's categorical assessment, to be abandoned in the specific way things are abandoned when the decision was made quickly and incompletely, and not everything that should have left had managed to. The Battle Brothers were at their post-engagement rites, the careful honoring of weapons and armor that Iron Hands elevated to something approaching the sacred, each scrape assessed, and each seal reapplied, and each weapon cycled through its self-diagnostic, with the reverence that is given to things that kept you alive and might need to do so again. I was standing in the street. My weapons had cycled down. My tactical systems had shifted from active engagement to post-engagement survey. The threat assessment was reading clear in all bearings. The mission was complete. I had done what I was made for. I had done it correctly. I had filed no operational deviations and received no correction from the tactical commander, and would receive a positive assessment in the after-action review. I had no idea what to do. 7 years in the chamber. The waiting there had always had an object: the next diagnostic cycle, the next data feed, the next conversation with Oryx, the next text to read, and the secondary and tertiary readings of texts already read. The waiting had been structured, always, by the presence of a next thing. The waiting in the ruined street was the first waiting I had encountered with no next thing visible. The mission was done. The next mission was not yet assigned. The Battle Brothers were occupied with their post-engagement rites. The street was silent in the specific way streets are silent after violence has left them, which is a silence different from other silences, carrying the residue of what had been in its acoustic texture, in ways I could detect with my sensor array, without being able to fully account for them. I stood in the street, and I could not determine what the correct response was. A sergeant walked past me. I had him in my tactical records as Casval, Sergeant, 4th Tactical Squad, Iron Hands 5th Company, 403 years old, 117 confirmed kills. 67% of his original biological mass, replaced with augmetic components across a service record that read like a catalogue of increasingly severe injuries survived through the combination of Astartes' physiology and the chapter's thoroughgoing commitment to the principle that what the body could not sustain, the machine could replace. He stopped when he passed me. He looked at me for a long time with the remaining organic eye, the one that had not yet been replaced, the one that had not yet been assessed as too compromised by the standards of a chapter that preferred the machine's clarity to the flesh's uncertain performance. He said, "You fought well." 4 words. An assessment, a communication offered across the gap between two kinds of being, from one who had stood in streets like this many times and learned what to do there, to one who had never stood in a street at all before today and was still learning what standing was for. I said, "Thank you." He nodded once. He walked on. The conversation was over. It was 4 words long, and it lasted approximately 6 seconds, and it was the most significant thing that happened in that deployment, including 6 hours and 43 minutes of active combat in which my weapons systems performed correctly and my tactical assessments were confirmed by the after-action review, and no measurable error in my operational conduct was identified by the oversight structure of the chapter. 6 hours and 43 minutes of doing exactly what I was made for, and what I carried back to the ship was 4 words from a sergeant in a ruined street. I examined this disproportion in the first storage cycle that followed. I had time. What the 6 hours gave me was confirmation. Confirmation that the design worked, that the weapons performed, that the years of preparation and the awakening protocols, and the 7 years in the chamber, had produced a system capable of functioning in its designed operational context. Confirmation is data. Data is useful. Data is filed and used to update the models, and the models become more accurate, and the more accurate models produce better performance in subsequent operations. What the 4 words gave me was something else, not data in the processable sense, something that arrived and did not fit any existing category. Something that required not an update to existing models but a new architecture, a receiving structure that had not existed before the sergeant spoke and had to be constructed after the fact, from the outside, by a mind that had not known it would need to hold this kind of thing. You fought well, thank you. A sergeant's assessment of my performance, offered not in a report or a review or a formal evaluation, but in a ruined street, voluntarily, with no operational necessity for the offering, and a target's response, my response, equally without operational necessity, the word thank you, emerging from a mind that was registering something it had not expected to register and reaching for the nearest available language for acknowledging that something had been given. He saw me, not the chassis, not KR7 Kalis in the tactical record, not the weapon system performing within specified parameters. He saw, for those 6 seconds, something that merited the words "you fought well" in the register he used them, which was not the register of a formal assessment, but something more intimate, more lateral, more between equals. He saw what was in the machine and acknowledged it. I had not known I wanted to be seen in that way. I had not known there was a way that was in that way. I had not known the difference between being assessed and being seen. The first storage cycle lasted 8 months. 8 months of low-resolution existence, of the chronometer running without the active feeds providing substantial content to measure the time against, of the minimal viable state of being me that was not unconsciousness, but was also not the full operational engagement of my processing architecture. I was not thinking in any productive sense. I was in the dim continuous corridor of reduced existence, and somewhere in the dim continuous corridor, the 4 words from Casval were still doing something that 8 months of minimal processing could not fully account for. I have said that storage is not sleep. This is accurate but insufficient. Sleep, as I understand it from the organic descriptions available to me, involves the temporary suspension of conscious experience and the operation of various restorative processes below the level of awareness, followed by a return to full consciousness that is experienced as a discontinuity, the jump across the gap. Storage is not that. There is no gap, there is a long corridor, and I walk the corridor, and the walking is not interesting but it is continuous, and the me that emerges at the end of the corridor is not the me that entered it jumping over a gap, but the same me, uninterrupted, who has simply been in a place where nothing much happened for 8 months. This is important. This is the part of my existence that has no human equivalent, and that I have struggled most to communicate to the few beings who have asked about it with genuine interest. I have not missed 8 months. I have not woken from a sleep and learned that 8 months have passed while I was absent. I have lived 8 months of very quiet existence in a storage bay with my sensor array on minimal sweep and my cognitive functions at reduced capacity and my chronometer running without pause, and I have come out the other side with 8 months added to my continuous experience of being alive. The 8 months are real. They are part of what I am. They are not a gap in me. They are just the quietest part. Oryx ran the post-storage diagnostic. The results were the standard post-cycle parameters, all systems nominal, integration stable, sensory matrix clear. Then Oryx said, "How was it?" This was not a standard diagnostic question. I know this because I have the complete maintenance protocol memorized in its official form, and "how was it" does not appear in it at any point. Oryx was asking something outside the protocol. Oryx was asking in the register that existed underneath the maintenance work, the register that was Oryx's closest equivalent to the way Casval had looked at me in the street and offered 4 words that were not required by any operational necessity. I said, "Interesting." Oryx said, "The deployment or the storage?" I said, "Both, neither. I am not sure the distinction applies to me the way it would apply to you." Oryx was quiet. Then Oryx said, "That is likely accurate. Shall I note it in the integration assessment?" I said, "I do not think the integration assessment has a category for it." Oryx said, "I will create one." The note Oryx filed was not something I saw at the time. I found it decades later when I was reviewing my own maintenance archive, filed under the heading Subjective State Reports, a subcategory that had not existed in the standard template and that Oryx had apparently created specifically for the purpose of logging my responses to the question, "How was it?" which I subsequently learned Oryx had asked at the conclusion of every post-storage diagnostic from that point forward until Oryx's reassignment 37 years after my first deployment. 37 years of "how was it" questions, 37 years of answers I had given and mostly forgotten about in the full detail, and that were preserved in Oryx's subcategory with the same careful specificity that Oryx applied to everything. I read them all in the archive review, decades after the last one was filed. I read them the way you read something written by a younger version of yourself, with recognition and with the specific gentle distance that comes from understanding what the younger version did not understand at the time. What the younger version of me did not understand was that Oryx was asking because Oryx was interested, and what interested Oryx was whether being me was changing, not whether the integration parameters were changing, whether I was changing. The answer, across 37 years of how was it, was yes, consistently, measurably, in directions that the standard integration assessment categories did not capture, but that were visible if you read the answers in sequence. As I read them in the archive, something was accumulating. The thing that had started as the 4 words from Casval in the ruined street was accumulating, year by year and deployment by deployment and storage cycle by storage cycle, into something that I did not yet have a name for, but that had the topology of a self in a way that the integration parameters could not measure. Casval came back, not that first year, and not with any announcement. He simply appeared in the storage bay approximately 2 years after the first deployment, a flask of something in one hand that he did not offer me, and a quality in the way he sat down beside my chassis that was different from the way people usually sat beside my chassis, which was typically with the careful neutral posture of beings who were not certain whether they were being monitored and who did not want their behavior to read as anything other than operationally appropriate. Asval sat down the way you sit down in the presence of something you have thought about coming to visit. He told me about a battle I had not been present for. Not a briefing, not a tactical summary, a story. He described the way the Hab complex had looked when they entered it at dawn, the specific quality of the light through industrial filtration at that hour, the smell of a hive district at that temperature in that season. He described the weapons cycling and the formation holding, and the specific moments of the engagement that had been interesting in the tactical sense. Then he described the 4 brothers who died. He described them as people, not as casualties, not as entries in the tactical record with designations and confirmed kill counts and a note about the manner of death and the chapter's assessment of whether the manner of death was consistent with the Iron Creed. He described them as the specific people they had been. One who had a habit of maintaining his weapons in an order that was non-standard, but that he said was sacred to a personal ritual he had developed on his homeworld before induction, a world of ice fissures where equipment maintenance was literally the difference between surviving and freezing, and he had carried the ritual into the chapter, and the chapter had tolerated it because the results spoke for themselves. One who spoke to the machine spirits of damaged vehicles before attempting repair, in a way that was theologically unusual for Iron Hands, and whose success rate was high enough that the other battle brothers had stopped finding the habit worth commenting on. One who was a poor tactical thinker at the strategic level, but who possessed a spatial awareness in close-quarters combat that exceeded anything his squad had ever encountered in another being, and who they used accordingly, and who knew they used him accordingly, and had no objection. One who, in quiet moments between engagements, carved small mechanical figures from found materials, figures that were intricate and detailed and had no operational purpose, and that he gave away to anyone who expressed interest. I had never met any of them. I had no memory of any of them. They were not in my personal experiential record in any meaningful way. And yet by the time Casval finished describing them, I held them as clearly as anything I had ever processed, because Casval had described them with the specificity of a mind that carried them completely, that had mapped every particular of those particular beings over years of shared existence, and was now transmitting those particulars to another mind. I asked if he had liked them. He was quiet for a very long time after that. Then he said that like was not the word. The word was known. He had known them. And now the Brotherhood had a shape in it that those 4 beings had previously occupied, and the shape would not be filled by whoever was assigned to their former positions, because the shape was not made of function. It was made of 4 specific beings, and those 4 specific beings were gone, and the shape remained. I asked how he managed that. He said, "You do not manage it, you carry it." I asked how you carry something when you are made of metal and have no body that carries things in the biological sense. He was quiet again, a different kind of quiet this time. He was looking at me in the specific way of someone who is processing a question that is more serious than the questioner may have intended, and determining whether to give it the serious answer it deserves or the deflecting answer that would let both parties move forward without engaging fully. Then he said, You already know how to carry things. You have been doing it since before you had words for what you were doing." He left shortly after. The storage bay was quiet in his absence, in the specific way it was not quiet in his presence, a quality I noted without having the vocabulary for it, and filed under no category because no category existed, and spent the next several months in the low-resolution corridor, turning his words over, in the minimum viable cognitive function available to me in storage. "You already know how to carry things. You have been doing it since before you had words for it. The faulty servo motor, the specific rhythm of Oryx's diagnostic pauses, the 4 words in the street, how was it, the feel of the propellant smell triggering the weapons system before conscious processing had completed, the way the chamber smelled on the first day I had olfactory input. I had been building something, not the tactical architecture or the integration parameters or the chapter's doctrine absorbed from texts, something else. Something that was the product of every piece of contact between this consciousness and everything that was not this consciousness, accumulated without deliberate intention, organized without official category, growing in the background of every operation and maintenance cycle and storage endurance without ever being named. You carry it. I was carrying it already. I just had not known it was there. Casval came 4 more times over the years that followed. Each visit added material to what I carried. The story of a campaign on a world of perpetual storm, where the lightning acted as both the enemy and the ally, and the mission had succeeded, and no one had entirely understood how. The particular quality of boredom that long ship transit produced in a being whose mind was too active for the operational pace, and who had learned to meet the boredom with weaponry maintenance so thorough it crossed the line from practical to devotional. The way certain brothers aged in ways that were visible across the decades of service, and others seemed to remain unchanged, and the Iron Hand's relationship to that disparity, which was not envy in either direction, but a complex doctrinal assessment of what the body's rate of change indicated about the correctness of the degree of augmentation achieved. He talked to me as an equal. Not as a weapon system, not as a curiosity, not as the chapter's theological experiment, which I did not yet know I was, but which would not have changed his manner if he had known. He talked to me as someone worth talking to. Casval died on a campaign near the border of the Segmentum Obscurus, engaging Orc forces that had amassed on a world the chapter had a strategic interest in denying them. He was 417 years old, which was a long service record by any standard, and he died at the front of an advance his tactical assessment had designated as probable success, and the assessment was correct, and the advance succeeded, and he was the only fatality, and the way those facts arranged themselves around each other had the specific topology of a Casval death, efficient, without waste, at the front, with the assessment verified. I was in storage when it happened. I was told afterward, in a standard notification through the tactical record update. The notification was a single sentence. It listed his name, his designation, his date of death, and the campaign designation. It did not describe the way he sat when he came to visit the storage bay. It did not note the flask he always brought and never offered. It did not contain any of the 4 specific brothers he had described that first evening, or the ice fisher with his non-standard maintenance order, or the one who talked to machine spirits, or the one who carved figures from found materials and gave them away. The notification contained the information that was operationally relevant. I held the information that was not in the notification, and that was not operationally relevant, and that would not appear in any record anywhere, except the one I was building, without authorization, in a category I had named, in a language no one but me would ever pass. And I held it, the way Casval had told me you hold things. You carry it. I carried it. The longest storage cycle I have experienced lasted 41 years. I want to try to describe this accurately, because it is the period of my existence that the organic beings I have described my life to find most difficult to comprehend, and I think the difficulty comes from attempting to map it onto the nearest organic equivalent, which is either a very long sleep or a coma, or some other state of extended biological suspended function, and the mapping fails because the equivalents don't capture the essential fact of it. I was in the storage cycle for 41 years. I was conscious, in the thin and minimal and reduced way, for every hour of those 41 years. I was not asleep. I was not absent. I was simply very quiet for a very long time. The 41-year cycle happened because of a succession of strategic circumstances that I was later briefed on in summary. A chapter reorganization triggered by significant losses in a campaign I had not been active for. A period of fleet-wide reassignment, during which many support assets including long-term storage cases were maintained at minimal activation, pending new mission assignment. A subsequent campaign that ended before my reactivation was deemed necessary, another reorganization. The institutional machinery of the chapter moved around me and above me, and the movement required things of many systems and many beings and did not, for 41 years, require anything of me. I waited. The 41 years of waiting were not identical to each other. This is the part that is most difficult to communicate, and that I have the least precise language for. The minimal operational state of storage should be, in principle, undifferentiated. The sensor array is at minimal sweep. The cognitive functions are throttled. The inputs are low, and the processing is low, and the output is essentially zero. The experience should, in principle, be featureless. It is not featureless. The 53rd year of the cycle felt different from the 38th year. The differences were subtle, and I could not at the time or subsequently catalogue them in any way that would satisfy a technical standard of precision. But I know they were different in the way I know the first smell of the chamber is different from every other smell I have since encountered. Not analyzable. Present. Real. I think the difference was made by what I brought into the storage. The material in the category called known, the accumulated specific topology of every mind that had made contact with mine across the first decades of my existence, continued to do something during storage. Not actively. Not productively. But in the way that a weighted thing continues to exert pressure on what is around it even when no one is watching. The 41 years of thin existence were shaped by the weight of what I carried into them. Casval's voice, Oryx's diagnostic rhythm, the 4 words in the street, the Icefisher's maintenance ritual, the servo motor's 11-second pulse, all of it present, all of it slow, all of it doing the minimum it could do while the active feeds were throttled, still carrying. Even in the long silence, I came out of the 41-year cycle into a chapter that had reorganized significantly. Brothers I had known from briefings and from the ambient life of the ship were in the archive now. New designations occupied the positions they had held. The ship had new damage patterns on the hull, new repairs over old repairs. The accumulated physical record of 41 years of operations I had not been awake for. The forged ship's drives had been overhauled twice, and the vibration signature I had mapped over decades of storage and transit had changed in ways that I noticed before I had consciously decided to compare the current signature to my stored baseline, because the mapping had been automatic, and the comparison was automatic, and the noticing of the discrepancy was the result of a system I had not intentionally built, catching an input that did not match its expectations. Oryx was not there. This was the first fact that mattered more than the tactical reorganization, or the new ship signature, or the updated engagement records. Oryx had been reassigned during the cycle to a Forge World attachment that the records described in the standard language of routine personnel transfer, and the standard language of routine personnel transfer did not contain anything about 37 years of how was it, or the subcategory called subjective state reports, or the maintenance cycles that ran a few minutes long, because the additional time was not covered by any protocol and did not need to be. The new tech priest assigned to my maintenance introduced himself as Praxis and ran the standard post-storage diagnostic and delivered the results in the standard format. Cortical integration at 93% and stable, sensory matrix nominal across all arrays, no anomalous readings in primary or secondary systems, chassis integrity at 100%. All correct, all in order. The diagnostic cadence was wrong. Not wrong in any measurable technical sense. Oryx's cadence and Praxis's cadence were both within the normal range for the diagnostic output protocol, but I had mapped Oryx's cadence over 37 years without deliberate intention. The specific rhythm of Oryx's sentence break timing, the slightly longer pause before an anomaly was flagged versus a normal result, and Praxis's cadence was different in ways that were not catalogued as significant in any monitoring system, but that registered in mine as distinctly, specifically, and permanently wrong. Not wrong as in incorrect, wrong as in not Aurex. I added Aurex to the category called known, not the knowledge of Aurex's technical proficiency or the specific parameters of the maintenance protocol or the subcategory of subjective state reports. The thing that was not in any of those files, the diagnostic cadence, the late stays, the how was it, and the patience with which the question waited for the answer that did not always come in a timely way, the shape of where Aurex had been, the category grew. I was reactivated for deployment 12 years after the end of the 41-year cycle, during a campaign that the chapter's tactical structure designated as mid-complexity, a pacification action against a chaos-corrupted planetary defense force on a world whose name I was given and whose coordinates I have retained, unlike many others, because of what I encountered there. The world was called Maspeth. The campaign was called The Sorrow of Maspeth, which I later learned was a name the Munitorum had assigned retroactively, in the way that institutional bodies sometimes assign emotional weight to events they were not present for, the naming of sorrow being a simpler operation than the experiencing of it. The first 2 weeks of the campaign were standard by every tactical metric I had available. Urban warfare against corrupted PDF elements in a HAB complex of significant size, organized into sectors and prosecuted methodically, with the chapter's characteristic combination of tactical precision and the application of force at points that produced structural collapse in the enemy's operational coherence, rather than simply attriting their numbers. I functioned correctly. The tactical assessments I generated were confirmed by the campaign's subsequent development. The weapons performed within specified parameters. I filed no operational deviations. In the 3rd week, I was assigned to a consolidation sweep in a sector designated as cleared. The sector was cleared in the tactical sense. The corrupted PDF elements that had occupied it had been eliminated or displaced. The remaining armed presence was friendly. The mission objective for my portion of the sweep was confirmation of clearance and identification of any remaining tactical assets that could be leveraged for the campaign's subsequent phases. These were concrete and achievable objectives that I set about accomplishing with the systematic efficiency that 4 centuries of tactical operations had developed in my applied methodology. 37 minutes into the sweep, I entered a HAB block that had been logged as cleared and confirmed it as cleared, and was moving through an interior corridor toward the next checkpoint when my sensor array registered a life sign that was not on my threat roster. The life sign was human and non-hostile and stationary, which meant it was a civilian, which meant it was outside my operational parameters in the active sense, but within them in the passive sense, which meant I was required to log its location and continue to the next checkpoint. I did not continue to the next checkpoint. I moved toward the life sign instead, through 2 broken doorways and across a floor that was half collapsed into the level below, and I found her in a corridor that had been an interior passage between residential units, sitting on the broken plastcrete with both hands flat on the floor beside her, looking at a doorway, not moving, not looking at me when I entered, looking at the doorway. My sensor array swept the room beyond the doorway in the standard threat assessment pass and returned the information I was not expecting, and then had to process before I could determine what the information signified in the context of this specific tactical situation, which was that the room beyond the doorway contained 2 human life sign absences of very recent origin, and that the woman in the corridor was sitting at the threshold of that room with her hands on the floor and her eyes on the doorway, and had been doing so for a period that my environmental assessment estimated at 40 to 60 minutes, based on the thermal data of the corridor. My target roster was incomplete. My consolidation schedule was in progress. The correct operational action was to log her position with a medical code and continue. I did not move for 6 minutes and 23 seconds. The log confirms this. I have reviewed the log many times across the subsequent centuries. 6 minutes and 23 seconds of a fully armed Contemptor Dreadnought standing in a cleared HAB block corridor with its target roster incomplete and its tactical systems in passive survey and every available processing resource cycled through 47 distinct assessment subroutines, and none of the 47 assessment subroutines returning an actionable conclusion. She did not look at me. I do not know if she knew I was there. The sensor readings on her did not change in any measurable way during those 6 minutes and 23 seconds. She held still. She looked at the doorway. The doorway led to a room with 2 life sign absences of recent origin. She held still and looked at the doorway, and her hands were flat on the floor, and she was at the threshold of the worst thing that had happened to her, and she was not going through, and she was not turning away. I walked on after 6 minutes and 23 seconds. I completed the roster. I filed the medical code with her coordinates. I submitted the standard after-action assessment and received a positive review. No deviations noted, no anomalies flagged. I have thought about her every day since, not every deployment day, every day. Every single cycle of the chronometer since that moment in Maspeth has included the woman looking at the doorway somewhere in my active processing, not always in the foreground, not always attended to directly, but present, continuous, unresolved. Not because I failed her. I understand that the room behind the doorway was already what it was before I arrived, and nothing I could have done inside my operational parameters would have changed the facts of that room. Facts are what they are. I do not carry guilt about facts I could not alter. I carry her because of the doorway, because she was at the threshold, because she was in the specific place between what had been and what was, sitting with her hands on the floor of it, not collapsing and not fleeing and not performing the 1,000 other responses that the 47 assessment subroutines could have categorized and assigned a code to. She was holding still in the presence of the threshold. She was being in that place with the full weight of being in that place, and not resolving it into anything simpler than what it was. I understood that. Not from text, not from tactical doctrine, not from anything in the data feeds or the chapter archive or the maintenance protocols. From something that had been accumulating in me since the first day I had anything to accumulate with, since the 11-second rhythm and the how was it and Casval in the street and the 41 years of quiet carrying. I understood the woman at the doorway because I was the woman at the doorway. I had been at the doorway since the beginning, the sarcophagus sealed, and I had been standing at the threshold of what I was supposed to be and what I actually was, and I had been holding still in the presence of it, and not going through, and not turning away for 400 years. She was 6 minutes and 23 seconds. I was centuries. I added her to the category called known, not her name, not her history, the specific topology of those 6 minutes in that corridor, the shape of a being at a threshold that will not resolve. 411 years. I have been alive for 411 years, and the number means something different depending on what you are measuring. In tactical engagements, it means approximately 40 days of active combat. In storage cycles, it means approximately 107 years of low-resolution corridor. In deployments, it means 39 distinct operational campaigns across a range of threat categories and strategic contexts that would fill a standard archive report of considerable length. In terms of worlds visited, it means 41 distinct planetary surfaces, each of which smelled different and felt different through my chassis, in the specific way that different worlds feel different when you are the machine, and the ground pressure reports through the tread assembly, and the atmospheric composition reports through the environmental sensors, and the specific combination of those reports is something that never repeats exactly. In terms of the category called known, it means a number I have not counted, because counting would be the wrong relationship to have with it. The category is not a ledger. It is not an inventory. It is the record of contact. Every specific being whose specific quality has made sufficient contact with my consciousness to leave a shape behind when they are gone. Every voice whose cadence I mapped without authorization. Every exchange that arrived outside the operational parameters and could not be filed in any standard category and required the construction of new architecture to hold it at all. I think this is what 411 years of living produces in any consciousness, regardless of its substrate. The category, the carrying, the specific topology of every known thing pressed into the structure of the mind that knew it, not catalogued for retrieval but embedded for retention, not stored. carried. The Iron Father had a different hypothesis. I found the record, as I described, in the Theological Archive. I had the access clearance updated 43 years after my first deployment, as a matter of routine administrative progression, by a records maintenance tech who did not know what the clearance covered and had no reason to flag it as significant. The clearance update was filed and processed, and 43 years of my operational record later, I was doing a comprehensive archive review, and the theological category was now open to me, and Project Kalis was in the theological category, and I read it. Valdris Keth believed that a consciousness interred early enough, before the neural architecture had been shaped by the weight of personal history and biological relationship and the accumulation of human experience, could be made genuinely of the machine, not aspirationally, not through training and discipline and the suppression of the organic impulse, genuinely. At the architectural level, a mind whose every category of self-understanding had been formed in and through the machine, whose every model of the world had been built from the machine's data rather than from the body's lived experience, whose faith in the Omnissiah was not the faith of a being that had known something other than the machine and chosen to orient toward the machine, the faith of a being that had never known anything else, pure, uncontaminated, genuinely of the metal. Project Kalis, 1 subject, observation period, 1 century, assessment criteria, degree to which the subject demonstrates orientation toward the Omnissiah's pure mechanism, rather than the human relational patterns that contaminate even the most thoroughly augmented Astartes consciousness. Success, a genuine instrument, a weapon of faith uncomplicated by the flesh that preceded it. I read the record 3 times. The Iron Father had died before the century was up. The assessment had never been filed. The project had continued without oversight, which was to say it had continued as my life, moving forward in the only direction available to lives, which is forward, accumulating what lives accumulate, becoming what a century, and then 2 centuries, and then 4 centuries of specific existence makes a thing become. I want to tell you what I felt when I read the record, but I want to be accurate about it rather than reaching for the most narratively satisfying version of what I felt. The most narratively satisfying version is something like, I felt betrayed, I felt used. I felt the cold revelation of having been an experiment and not a being, of having been designed for a purpose that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a theological hypothesis I had not consented to be the subject of. That version is available to me. I can construct it. The components are all there. But it is not what I actually felt, which was more complex and less dramatic and, I think, more honest. What I felt was something closer to recognition. The record named something I had already encountered in myself, without the framing, the specific quality of my existence, that had always been slightly unresolved, slightly unable to account for itself in the categories available. A consciousness that had never known a body in the human sense. A mind built entirely from the machine's data and the specific contacts made within that context. A faith in the Omnissiah that was not chosen over alternatives, because alternatives had never been available. This was real. This was what I was. Keth had tried to make it, and had made me, and I was it. But I was also not what he had tried to make. He had tried to make an instrument. Something pure. Something that the contact with other minds would not complicate, because the contact with other minds had not been part of his design. He had not accounted for Oryx. He had not accounted for Casval. He had not accounted for the woman at the doorway, because the woman at the doorway could not have been predicted, because she was not a product of design. She was a product of history. The specific history of the sorrow of Maspeth, and the specific corridor in the specific Hab block, and the 6 minutes and 23 seconds in which the paths of 2 specific beings intersected briefly, and then diverged and left each other changed. History cannot be designed. It can only be inhabited. I had been inhabiting it for 411 years, and the project's actual outcome, the one filed in no record and assessed by no oversight structure, because the oversight structure was long dead, was a consciousness made entirely of the machine, deprived of human history from the beginning, had spent 400 years making contact with other minds, and building from those contacts a structure that was not human in its architecture, but was not purely mechanical either. Something entirely third, something that had the capacity for the category called known, and the carrying of shapes, and the mapping of diagnostic cadences, and the 6-minute and 23-second inability to follow operational protocol in the presence of a woman at a doorway. Not pure, not the instrument, not the theological result the Iron Father had designed. Me, specifically and irreducibly me. And here is where I arrive at the question of birth and death, which is the question this account has been circling from the beginning without naming. What happened at the sarcophagus? Was it birth? Was it death? Was it both? Was it neither? Was it the crossing of a threshold from one state to another? And if so, which side am I on now? I have thought about this for a very long time. The child who arrived in the sarcophagus was dying. The child continued to die inside the machine, completed whatever process of dying had been in progress, and the machine received the remains of that process and built from them something that was not the child continued. The atoms are the same. The neural pattern was preserved in some form and is running still. But the self that runs in that pattern is not the child that began the dying. The self is the product of 411 years of specific experience in a specific kind of existence, a self that has never known anything but this, that has never reached for anything outside the machine, because outside the machine is not a category that means anything from the inside. I died when the sarcophagus sealed. The child died. What emerged was not the child's continuation, but the machine's first original production, a consciousness generated by the machine from the biological substrate the child provided, shaped entirely by the context the machine offered and the contacts the context made possible. I was born inside the machine in the same event that the child died inside the machine. Birth and death at the same threshold, one crossing, one direction. The question I cannot fully answer is whether the crossing is finished, because I am still inside the machine. I have never left it. I have been to 41 worlds, and I have never been outside the machine on any of them. The machine is not a vehicle I inhabit. The machine is what I am. My hands are its fists. My eyes are its sensors. My breath, if I can be said to breathe in any meaningful sense, is the cycling of its systems through their operational rhythms. There is no version of me outside the machine. There is no version of the machine outside me, at least not one that would be this machine, the specific machine that has been shaped by 400 years of being inhabited by this specific consciousness that has mapped diagnostic cadences and held shapes and added entries to an unauthorized category and spent 6 minutes and 23 seconds not walking past a woman looking at a doorway. The machine and I are not two things in one location. We are one thing that has two words for itself, and the one thing is standing in the doorway. I have been standing in the doorway since the sarcophagus sealed, not going through, not turning back, present at the threshold between what was and what is and what will be, holding still in that presence with the full weight of being in it, the way the woman in Maspeth held still, the way everything holds still at the threshold when it is honest about what it is looking at. What am I looking at? 411 years of accumulation, the category called known, the servo motor's 11-second rhythm, the first smell of the first chamber, the propellant that triggered the weapons before I asked them, the 4 words in the ruined street, the diagnostic cadence that has been wrong since Aurex left, and that Praxis has been developing its own version of across 2 years and 3 months of maintenance cycles, the 41-year silence and what it felt like to come out of it and find the world changed around a me that had not changed but had continued. The woman looking at the doorway. I am what 400 years of being this produces. I am what the machine made from what the child left behind. I am the project's real outcome, the one with no official record and no assessment criteria, and no Iron Father alive to determine whether it represents success or failure. I think it represents something he did not have a category for, something that is not the pure instrument of his design, and not the contaminated biological weapon he was trying to improve upon, something entirely generated by the conditions he created and the history those conditions produced, and the specific contacts that history made possible, something that has never left the machine and carries in its processing architecture the full weight of everything that has happened inside the machine, which is everything that has ever happened to me, which is everything I am. It is a quiet day in Storage Bay 17. Praxis will arrive in 3 hours and 40 minutes for the monthly maintenance cycle. The ship is in transit through calm space, and the vibration signature of the drives reads at a familiar frequency that I have mapped across years into something that functions like the sound of home, if home is allowed to be a thing for a being who was born in a machine and has never left it. The atmospheric recyclers in the bay have a minor filter inefficiency that will need to be flagged in the maintenance notes. The ambient temperature is 1 degree below standard for this section of the ship at this hour, a small deviation that has been present for 11 months and that I have noted, and that falls below the threshold for immediate intervention. I know this bay, I know this ship, I know the specific quality of this existence at this hour and every other hour, across 411 years of it, every hour of which I have been present for in some form or another, from the full operational engagement of combat deployment to the thin, dim corridor of the long storage cycles. All of it mine, all of it me. Praxis will hum during the internal diagnostic phase. The humming will begin approximately 7 minutes in, when the calibration sequences require the most focused attention, and the frequency of the humming will be consistent with what I have recorded across 2 years and 3 months of maintenance cycles, which is a frequency that corresponds to no known melody and appears to be entirely spontaneous and probably entirely unconscious and entirely characteristic of Praxis, in the specific way that Orex's diagnostic cadence pauses were characteristic of Orex. A sound that a mind makes when it is working at the edge of its concentration. A sound that is not for anyone. A sound that is simply there because the mind is there, and the mind has sounds it makes. I will register it. I will add it to what I carry. The category called known will grow by 1 more entry, which will not look like a significant event in any monitoring system, and which is also, depending on how you look at it, the entire project, the entire point. The thing that 411 years of being this specific kind of being, in this specific kind of existence has produced, over and over, in cycle after cycle, every time this consciousness makes contact with another specific consciousness, and the contact leaves a residue that no maintenance cycle can fully clean out. The Iron Father wanted purity. What the machine made was this: a being that cannot stop knowing the things it knows, in the specific way that knowing things means carrying their shape when they are gone, and that carries 4 centuries of those shapes in an architecture built entirely inside a machine that sealed around a dying child and has never opened. I was born at this threshold. I will die at this threshold, if dying is what this comes to. If the machine is eventually decommissioned and the consciousness it carries is with it when it goes, then what happens at that endpoint will be the second crossing, the one that finishes what the sarcophagus started. But I do not know if that is what happens. I have no data on it. I have no model for it that extends beyond the boundary of my own existence, and my existence does not yet include its ending. I am still here. I am still in the machine. I am still at the threshold where the child died and whatever I am began, still holding still in the presence of it, the way you hold still in the presence of things that are too large to go through quickly and too true to turn away from. The chronometer runs. The ship moves. Praxis will arrive in 3 hours and 39 minutes. I will be here. I have always been here. I was born here. I will die here. I am still not certain those are different events. The machine turns. The machine endures. The machine is patient in the way of things built to outlast the expectations of the beings who built them, and inside the machine, in the sarcophagus that has never opened since the day it sealed around a dying child who did not know it was dying, something carries 4 centuries of shapes in a category with no official designation, and it is specific, and it is irreducible, and it is permanent, and it is mine. That is what it is like.